It was late at night when Sarah's car broke down on the empty highway. The wind howled through the dark forest that lined the road. She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. Frustrated, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out to check under the hood. The engine hissed and smoked, making it clear she wouldn't be going anywhere soon. Looking down the road, she spotted a faint neon glow through the trees. Squinting, she could just make out the words, "Motel, Vacancy." With no other choice, she grabbed her backpack, locked her car, and started walking toward the light. The motel was old and run down. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the sign flickered erratically. A single light bulb buzzed above the office door. Sarah hesitated, but decided it was better than spending the night in her car. Inside, a bell chimed as she pushed the door open. The air smelled of mildew, and the walls were covered with faded wallpaper. An old man sat behind the counter, his glasses thick and smudged. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yes," Sarah replied. "My car broke down." The man nodded slowly and handed her a key attached to a large wooden block. "Room 6, he said. "End of the row, no visitors." "Thanks," Sarah muttered, unsure who she would even invite out here. She stepped outside and walked past the other rooms. The curtains in most of the windows were drawn tight, but one flickered with the faint glow of a television. Room 6 was at the farthest end, barely lit by a flickering bulb. The key fit with a heavy click, and Sarah pushed the door open. The room smelled musty, and the carpet was stained, but it was warm, and the bed looked clean enough. Exhausted, she locked the door, dropped her backpack on the chair, and fell onto the bed. Sarah had just begun to drift off when she heard it, a faint scratching noise like nails on wood. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside, near the window. She got up slowly, tiptoeing across the creaky floorboards, and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. The parking lot was empty except for her car and a few others. The trees swayed in the wind, casting eerie shadows. She shook her head, convincing herself it was just a branch scraping the side of the building. Climbing back into bed, she tried to ignore the unease that crept up her spine. Just as her eyes closed again, the noise returned, this time louder and closer. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. "Rats," she whispered to herself, trying to stay calm. She turned on the bedside lamp and looked around. The room was silent again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The next morning, Sarah went to the office to check out, but her car wasn't fixed, and she needed more time. She told the old man at the counter about the noises during the night. "Old place," he said without looking up. "Makes sounds." Before she could argue, a man stepped in. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He glanced at Sarah and then at the old man. "Room 6? He asked her quietly. "Yes," she said, frowning. "Why?" The man lowered his voice. "Don't stay another night." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, glancing at the old man, who now stared at them both with narrowed eyes. "Just trust me," the man insisted. "People disappear from that room." "All right, that's enough," the old man barked. "You need to leave now." The younger man looked at Sarah one last time, his expression desperate. Then he turned and walked out the door. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the man's warning as she returned to room 6. She tried to distract herself by calling a tow truck, but the signal was still dead. Frustrated, she decided to explore the motel grounds. Behind the building, she found an overgrown path that led into the woods. She followed it for a short distance until she stumbled upon something strange, a small, crumbling shack with a padlock on the door. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the woods. Sarah spun around, her heart racing, but saw nothing. Feeling uneasy, she hurried back to the motel. That night, she couldn't sleep. The scratching noises returned, louder and more insistent. She turned on the light and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint red stain on the carpet near the bed. It looked like it had been scrubbed, but not well enough. "Maybe it's just wine," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew better. Determined to figure out what was going on, Sarah began searching the room. She tapped on the walls, checked under the bed, and opened the closet. At first, nothing seemed out of place until she moved the rug. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor with a rusted metal handle. Her hands trembled as she pried it open. The smell that wafted out was foul, like rotting meat. She shined her flashlight into the hole and saw a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Don't do this," she whispered to herself, but curiosity won. She climbed down slowly, her heart pounding with every step. At the bottom, she found a small, damp room lit by a single swinging bulb. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars. Dozens of jars filled with murky liquid and unidentifiable objects. In the corner, a bloody knife lay on a table next to a stack of photographs. Sarah picked one up and gasped. It was a picture of her car, taken earlier that day. Panicked, Sarah ran back up the stairs and into her room. She locked the trapdoor, shoved the rug back over it, and grabbed her backpack. She had to leave, now. As she opened the door to leave, she froze. The old man was standing in the doorway, his expression cold and unreadable. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice calm but menacing. "I'm leaving," Sarah said, trying to push past him. He grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "No one leaves room 6. Sarah screamed and kicked, breaking free from his grasp. She ran out into the parking lot, but the younger man from earlier was nowhere to be seen. The neon motel sign flickered, casting an eerie glow on the lot. She ran toward the woods, hoping to find the path she'd discovered earlier. Behind her, she heard the old man shouting and the sound of heavy footsteps. She didn't dare look back. Sarah burst through the trees and found herself at the shack. Without thinking, she yanked on the padlock until it broke, her adrenaline fueling her strength. She shoved the door open and stepped inside. The shack was empty, except for a pile of old clothes and a rusty gas can. She slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, trying to catch her breath. Outside, the footsteps grew closer. The old man's voice was low and taunting. "You can't hide forever." Desperate, Sarah grabbed the gas can and tipped it over, spilling its contents across the floor. She found a box of matches on a shelf and struck one. The flame flickered in her shaking hand as she tossed it onto the gasoline. Flames erupted, filling the shack with smoke and heat. Sarah kicked open the door and ran, the fire spreading quickly behind her. The old man screamed, but she didn't stop to see what happened. By the time Sarah reached the highway, the sun was rising. A truck driver spotted her and pulled over, offering her a ride to the nearest town. She didn't tell him everything, only that she needed help. When they reached town, she called the police. But when they arrived at the motel, it was gone. The fire had reduced it to ashes, and there was no sign of the old man or the trapdoor in room 6. Sarah left town that day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears the scratching, and she wonders if she really escaped at all. Months passed after Sarah's escape. She tried to move on, relocating to a busy city where she felt surrounded and safe. She sold her car and avoided long road trips. But no matter how hard she tried, the memories of the motel refused to fade. At night, she had nightmares. In these dreams, she was always back in room 6, staring at the red stain on the floor. The scratching sounds would grow louder until the trapdoor flew open, and something she couldn't see would pull her into the darkness. Sarah told herself they were just dreams, but small things began happening in her waking life, things she couldn't explain. She often found her belongings misplaced, as if someone had been rifling through them while she was gone. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Once, she woke up to find her bedroom window wide open, though she was sure she had locked it before bed. The final straw came one night when Sarah returned home from work and found a photo pinned to her door. It was the same photo she'd seen under the motel, her car parked on the side of the highway. There were no fingerprints, no clues about how it got there. Terrified, Sarah called the police. They searched her apartment and the surrounding area but found nothing unusual. The officer told her it was likely a prank or someone trying to scare her. But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. Room 6 was reaching out to her again. One night, as Sarah lay awake, her phone rang. The screen displayed a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. At first, there was silence. Then a raspy voice whispered, "You shouldn't have left." Her heart raced. "Who is this?" "You belong to us now," the voice replied, followed by the faint sound of scratching. The line went dead. Panicking, Sarah immediately called the police again, but the number couldn't be traced. Overwhelmed, she packed a bag and drove to a friend's house, unwilling to spend another night alone. Her friend Rachel tried to comfort her. "Maybe it's just someone messing with you. It could be the guy from the motel or someone who heard what happened." "But how would they know my address?" Sarah asked, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. Rachel didn't have an answer. Sarah knew she couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every shadow. She realized there was only one way to end it. She had to go back to where it started. With Rachel's reluctant agreement, the two of them drove to the small town near the motel's location. Sarah hoped to find answers, maybe in the ashes, maybe from someone who had seen or heard what really happened that night. When they arrived, Sarah's stomach dropped. The motel's site wasn't abandoned as she had expected. In its place was a freshly built structure with a bright new sign that read, "Sunrise Inn, now open." "I thought it burned down," Rachel said, frowning. "It did," Sarah whispered. "This can't be real." Ignoring Rachel's protests, Sarah walked into the lobby. It smelled clean and new, a stark contrast to the mildew-stained memory she carried. A young woman stood behind the counter, smiling brightly. "Welcome. Do you need a room?" she asked cheerfully. Sarah's mouth went dry. No, I was here before, a long time ago. I just wanted to ask what happened to the old motel." The woman tilted her head. "Old motel? Oh, you mean the rumor? People say there used to be a creepy old motel here, but that's just a local ghost story. This place has been vacant for years before we built on it." "Vacant?" Sarah echoed, her heart pounding. "What about room 6? The woman's smile faltered for a split second. "Sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." Refusing to leave without answers, Sarah and Rachel drove into town to visit the local library. There, they combed through old newspapers, looking for any mention of the fire or the motel's history. They finally stumbled upon an article from decades earlier. Local motel site of serial disappearances. The story told of travelers who vanished without a trace, their last known locations traced back to the motel. The owner, an older man named Harold Fletcher, was suspected but never charged. He vanished when the investigation heated up and the case went cold. "That's him," Sarah said, her finger trembling over a grainy photograph of the old man from the motel. "But how is he still alive?" Rachel asked. "That article's from 30 years ago?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She flipped to the last page of the article, where a quote from a surviving guest chilled her to the core. "I stayed in room 6. At night, I heard scratching. I barely made it out alive." The two returned to the new Sunrise Inn under the cover of darkness. With flashlights and tools, they snuck into the property and headed toward the area where room 6 once stood. "Are we really doing this?" Rachel whispered nervously. "I need to know," Sarah replied. The ground where room 6 had been was disturbingly solid, as if someone had intentionally buried any trace of the foundation. But Sarah knew better. She began digging, tearing through the soil with a shovel. After what felt like hours, she struck something hard, wood, a door. "Oh," Rachel breathed. The trapdoor creaked open, releasing a foul stench even worse than before. Beneath was the same staircase Sarah had seen months ago, untouched by time or fire. "No way am I going down there," Rachel said, stepping back. "You don't have to," Sarah replied, gripping her flashlight. "But I do." Sarah descended into the darkness, the air thick and suffocating. The jars were still there, lined up like silent witnesses, but now they seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. In the center of the room stood a figure, Harold Fletcher. "You came back," he rasped, smiling wickedly. "I knew you would. They always do." Sarah tried to back away, but the door above slammed shut, trapping her in the suffocating darkness. Rachel's muffled shouts grew faint as the man stepped closer. "This place is ours," Harold said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And now, so are you." The last thing Sarah heard before the world went black was the sound of scratching, this time all around her. The new Sunrise Inn remains open, its rooms always filled with travelers who come and go without incident. But room 6? It doesn't exist, or so the staff claims. Still, locals say they see shadows moving in the woods behind the property, and on quiet nights, some swear they hear faint scratching beneath the floor. No one who stays too long asks questions. After all, some stories are better left untold. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the small, suffocating basement room. Instead, she was standing in a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with doors, all marked with the number 6. Each door looked identical, with faint scratches near the bottom, as though something or someone had clawed at them in desperation. Her flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space. A cold, damp breeze swept past her, carrying a faint whisper. "You shouldn't have returned." Sarah turned in every direction but saw no one. Trembling, she reached for the nearest door and pushed it open. Inside, she found herself looking at her own motel room from months ago. The same stained carpet, the same worn furniture. But something was off. On the bed lay a shape covered by a thin, blood-stained sheet. Slowly she approached and pulled back the fabric. She gasped. It was her lifeless body staring back with hollow eyes and a frozen scream etched on her face. "No!" she screamed, stumbling backward out of the room. The door slammed shut on its own, and she turned to run down the endless hallway. Doors rattled as she passed, the scratches on them growing louder, sharper. The whispers followed her, growing into agonized wails. Up above, Rachel fought to open the trap door. "Sarah!" she screamed, pounding on the wooden slab. No answer came. She could hear faint noises below, whispers and scraping sounds, but they were too quiet to make out. Frustrated, she ran back to the car, grabbing the crowbar from the trunk. As she returned, the air around her grew colder. Shadows seemed to creep closer, the tree branches above twisting unnaturally. When she struck the trapdoor with the crowbar, the wood didn't splinter but absorbed the blow with a sickeningly soft sound like flesh. "What is this?" Rachel muttered, her breath visible in the icy air. Suddenly the trapdoor burst open from beneath, but instead of revealing a staircase, the hole was filled with darkness so black it seemed alive. From within, a hand shot out and grabbed Rachel's ankle. She screamed, kicking at it, but the grip was too strong. Before she could escape, she was pulled into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind her. Rachel landed in the same endless hallway Sarah had stumbled into. She could feel the presence of something watching her, following her movements. "Sarah!" she called out, but her voice echoed strangely, as if the space itself was mocking her. Behind her, one of the doors creaked open. Seeing a dim light spilling from the room. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped inside. The room was filled with the jars Sarah had described, but instead of murky liquid, each jar contained faces, twisted, screaming faces frozen in expressions of terror. Rachel backed away, her stomach churning, when she heard a familiar voice. "Rachel." It was Sarah's voice, weak and trembling. "Sarah? Where are you?" Rachel spun around, desperate to find her friend. "I'm here," the voice whispered, coming from one of the jars. Rachel's eyes locked onto it, horrified to see Sarah's face trapped inside. Her eyes blinked, tears streaming down as her mouth moved. "You shouldn't have come," Sarah whispered. "It won't let us leave." Rachel stumbled back, her head spinning. The light in the room flickered violently as an ear-splitting roar filled the air. She grabbed a jar, intent on freeing Sarah, but it burned her hands. The sound grew louder as the shadows in the room began to move, taking the form of Harold Fletcher. "You both belong to me," he growled, his hollow eyes glowing red. "And now you'll join the others." Rachel knew she had to do something fast. She remembered the lighter in her jacket pocket and grabbed it, setting fire to the edge of the room. The flames caught quickly, consuming the jars and spreading across the walls. Harold howled in fury, his shadowy form flickering like a dying candle. As the flames reached Sarah's jar, a bright light burst from it, knocking Rachel off her feet. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the woods, the trapdoor nowhere in sight. "Sarah?" she called out, tears streaming down her face. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the highway. She collapsed onto the ground, sobbing, unsure if she had truly freed Sarah or condemned her forever. Months later, Rachel returned to her normal life, but things were never the same. Every night she dreamed of the hallway, the endless doors, and the screams trapped inside the jars. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. One evening, as she was walking home, she noticed a flyer taped to a lamppost. It advertised a new motel opening just outside the city, a franchise called Sunrise Inn. The address was different, but the logo was eerily familiar. Beneath the flyer, scrawled in red ink, were 3 words: "You're not safe." Rachel ripped the flyer down, her hands trembling. But as she turned to leave, she saw the same message etched faintly into the pavement beneath her feet, accompanied by the sound of distant scratching. And she knew the cycle wasn't broken. It had only just begun. Rachel tried to convince herself that she was imagining things. She changed apartments, changed cities, and even tried to change her identity. But no matter how far she went, the memories and the subtle signs followed her. Scratching sounds on walls, whispering voices in the wind, and shadows that lingered too long. One evening, after another sleepless night, she made a decision. She couldn't live in fear anymore. If the darkness was following her, she needed to confront it once and for all. She drove out of the city and followed her gut, letting it guide her back to where it all started. The place where the Sunrise Inn now stood was unnaturally quiet. The parking lot was empty, but the lights glowed warmly and a vacancy sign blinked steadily. Rachel hesitated for a moment before stepping through the glass doors. Inside, a cheerful woman at the counter greeted her. It was the same receptionist Sarah had described, with the same unsettlingly bright smile. "Welcome back," the woman said, as if Rachel had been expected. "I'd like a room," Rachel replied. "Of course." The receptionist handed her a key. "Room 6, just for you." Rachel walked down the hallway, clutching the key tightly in her hand. The air grew heavier with each step. The door to room 6 stood at the end of the hall, its scratched surface telling a story of countless others who had come before her. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, it felt like walking into a memory. The familiar stained carpet, the outdated furniture, the faint stench of mildew, all as Sarah had described. She set her bag down and stood in the center of the room, waiting. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. But then, the scratching started. Rachel knelt on the floor where she knew the trapdoor would be and began peeling back the carpet. It wasn't easy. Her hands shook with every tug, but eventually the wooden hatch was revealed. Unlike Sarah, Rachel didn't hesitate. She pulled it open and descended into the darkness. The basement was as Sarah had described, jars lining the walls, their contents shimmering with trapped souls. At the center stood Harold Fletcher, his face a blend of shadows and fire. He grinned wickedly, his eyes locked on Rachel. "You came back," he said, his voice a rasping echo. "Ready to take your place?" Rachel's heart pounded, but she didn't show her fear. "I'm here to stop you." "You think you're the first?" Harold sneered. "Many have tried. You cannot break what is eternal." But Rachel wasn't listening. She took out a small tin from her pocket, a container of salt mixed with lighter fluid. With shaking hands, she began scattering the mixture across the room, ignoring Harold's growls of rage. The air grew thick with smoke and heat as the jars began to shatter, their captive lights bursting free like fireflies. "No," Harold bellowed, his form writhing as the flames reached him. "You don't understand. You'll destroy everything." "That's the point," Rachel said, dropping her lighter onto the trail of fluid. The room erupted into flames, a deafening roar consuming the space. Rachel braced herself, expecting pain or oblivion, but instead, she felt a strange calm wash over her. She closed her eyes, letting the heat envelop her. When Rachel opened her eyes, she was standing in a quiet forest. The night was clear, the stars shining brighter than she had ever seen. She turned to see Sarah, her face free of fear and her smile warm. "You did it," Sarah said softly. "You freed us." Rachel felt tears streaming down her face. "Is it really over?" "For us, yes," Sarah replied, taking her hand. "But you still have a life to live." Before Rachel could respond, the forest faded, and she found herself standing in the Sunrise Inn parking lot. The building was gone, replaced by an empty field. The sign, the lot, the motel, everything had vanished as though it had never been there. Rachel stood in silence for a long time. The oppressive weight she'd carried for months was finally gone. She turned back to her car and drove away, never looking back. Years later, rumors of a haunted highway motel persisted. Travelers whispered about shadowy figures and strange disappearances, but no one could ever pinpoint the exact location. Rachel, now older and living a quiet life, heard these stories on rare occasions. She no longer jumped at shadows or feared the dark. She had faced a nightmare and won. But sometimes, when the wind howled late at night, she thought she could still hear faint scratching, a reminder that some doors, even when closed, can never be completely forgotten. It was a cold, stormy evening when Lisa's car broke down on a desolate highway. Thick raindrops pelted her windshield as the engine sputtered and died. She cursed her luck and glanced at her phone. No signal. The nearest town was miles away, but then she noticed a flickering neon sign ahead. Silver Moon Motel. Grabbing her coat, Lisa ran through the rain to the motel's office. The place looked old and weathered, with peeling paint and a few broken windows. Inside, the smell of mildew hit her, but it was dry. A man sat behind the counter, his expression distant. "Need a room?" he asked in a flat tone. His name tag read John. Lisa nodded. "Just for the night. My car broke down." He slid a key across the counter. "Room 8. Check out by noon." There was something unsettling about John's demeanor, but Lisa brushed it off. She was tired and just wanted to sleep. Carrying her small bag, she walked toward the room. The motel's hallway was dimly lit, with the carpet damp beneath her feet. She shivered as she reached room 8. Lisa stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The room was basic: a bed, a small TV, a single chair, and a bathroom. Everything smelled musty. She locked the door and changed into dry clothes. As she lay on the bed, trying to relax, she noticed odd scratches on the walls. They looked like claw marks, deep and erratic. A chill ran down her spine. She tried to brush it off as damage from past guests or pets. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Lisa froze. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she walked to the door. "Who is it?" she called out. No answer. Her heart pounded as she peered through the peephole. No one was there. She shook her head, blaming her nerves, and returned to bed. Moments later, the knocking resumed, louder this time. Lisa jumped up. When she checked the peephole again, she saw nothing but darkness. Panic set in. She debated whether to confront whoever was out there or call for help, but her phone still had no signal. The knocking stopped, but the silence was even worse. Lisa lay back down, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind or her imagination, but then she heard it. Whispers. They were faint at first, like someone murmuring right outside her door. Straining her ears, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. Lisa pressed her ear against the wall. The whispers grew louder. She couldn't make out the words, but they sounded urgent. Terrified, she backed away from the wall, grabbing her bag and deciding she couldn't stay here. As she reached for the door handle, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. Lisa's breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight. The beam of light revealed the scratches on the walls had multiplied. They were fresh, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at them moments ago. Lisa was determined to leave. She unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily silent, the storm outside now a dull roar. She crept toward the exit, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Halfway down the hall, she felt a presence behind her. Turning quickly, she aimed the light down the corridor but saw nothing. Yet she could feel it, a cold, oppressive energy pressing against her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. No reply. Then faint footsteps echoed behind her. Lisa bolted, running toward the lobby. As she reached the door, she found it locked. She pounded on it, screaming for John. When he finally appeared, his face was pale, and he seemed disoriented. "What's wrong?" he asked, though his tone lacked genuine concern. Someone is in this place. I need to leave." John's eyes darkened. "No one's here but you and me," he said, his words chilling. Lisa demanded to know what was going on. John hesitated, but then spoke. "The Silver Moon has history," he admitted. "Bad things happened here. People disappear. Guests hear voices, see things they can't explain. Most never come back." Lisa's stomach turned. "Why didn't you warn me? Would you have believed me?" he replied. She stared at him, realizing he didn't look afraid. He looked resigned, as if he knew more than he let on. "I'm leaving," Lisa said firmly. She turned and pushed the lobby door open, stepping into the stormy night. Outside, Lisa's relief was short-lived. As she ran to her car, she noticed the rain was no longer falling. The air was eerily still. When she reached her car, the tires were slashed. Panic set in as she turned back toward the motel. It no longer looked the same. The neon sign was gone, replaced by dark windows and crumbling walls. It looked abandoned, as though it had been deserted for years. "This can't be happening," Lisa whispered. She stumbled back toward the entrance, but the door wouldn't budge. Behind her, a shadow moved. She whipped around, shining her flashlight, but there was nothing there. Whispers surrounded her, louder and more menacing than before. Lisa screamed, pounding on the door, begging to be let inside. Suddenly, it creaked open. Inside, the motel was in ruins. The furniture was rotted, the walls covered in mold. Lisa heard laughter, not cheerful but mocking. She turned and saw John standing in the shadows. "I told you," he said. "The Silver Moon doesn't let anyone go." Before she could respond, the shadows around her began to move, forming shapes of people. Former guests who had never left. Their faces were twisted in anguish, their eyes empty. Lisa backed away, but the shadows closed in. John watched, emotionless. "You should have stayed in your room." As the shadows consumed her, Lisa's screams echoed through the motel, blending with the whispers. The storm outside resumed, hiding the horrors within. The next morning, the Silver Moon Motel appeared perfectly normal. The neon sign flickered, and the hallways were clean and quiet. John sat at the counter as a new guest walked in, drenched from the rain. "Need a room?" John asked, sliding a key across the counter. The guest nodded, unaware of the nightmare that awaited.